master class, and today the faculty is Dr. Dharmesh Kapoor from Hyderabad. He will be introduced by my senior colleague Dr. Ashokananda Konar. I am pleased to have Dr. Ashokananda Konar as a moderator of this meeting, and Dr. Konar is the senior faculty and the clinical director at PRLS Hospital, Kolkata. And he will be joined by to another senior faculty, Dr. Devashish Datta, who is a consultant gastroenterologist at Fortis Hospital, Kolkata, and Dr. Bhaskar Vikas Pal, who is also a senior faculty in PRLS Hospital, Kolkata. So I am inviting Dr. Konar to start the meeting by introducing Dr. Kapoor.
Good evening, everybody. And I would initially thank Dr. Sujit Chaudhary for giving us an opportunity to have this meeting today. And we are really not only pleased, we are really thrilled that Dr. Dharmesh Kapoor has joined us from Hyderabad. As you all know, that Hyderabad is having a lot of problem following a deluge and heavy rains and loss of electricity, loss of life, and all sorts of natural calamities. But I'm very happy that Dr. Kapoor is with us today. We know Dharmesh is one of the brightest mind in hepatology today in India. I sometimes think that we have Panchapandav, like in cricket, they have Sachin, Saurav, Dravid, Lakshman, and Sehwag. We have also at least five, if not more, very bright persons reigning at this moment in India. Dharmesh is certainly one of those, and we are I think we should all be eagerly waiting for his deliberation. Today, we are discussing a clinical problem which is not very rare, and that is called refractory ascites. I am not going to give you any lecture on refractory ascites. We all know, and we know the difficulties in its management and coming to a diagnosis. So, with these few words, I think we should start the meeting, and I would request Dr. Dharmesh to start his case presentation. Dr. Dharmesh, please.
Thank you very much, sir. I hope I am heard loud and clear and the screen is visible.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Right. Can we minimize this, sir?
Shujit, you have to, you ask, yeah, your slides. I think you have to first, we are not seeing your slides. We can see you, but I think the slides.
Can you see, sir?
Yes, it has come.
Is it all right, sir? Is it all seen on full screen?
Yes, it's fine. Yes.
Right. So good evening, everyone, and really honored to be here for this meeting held by the Kolkata Gut Club, and for the very kind words of both Dr. Sujit and Dr. Ashokananda Konar. So in the next few minutes, I'll walk you through a case, something that we see day in and day out in our clinical practice. But maybe by the end of this talk, I would hope that our approach to this problem would be a little different from what we normally have. So we all know that patients with liver disease, as per the timetable, when they decompensate, more often than not, they decompensate with ascites, and this happens with a frequency of 6 to 7% per year in a patient who's got compensated cirrhosis. So which means that at the end of a decade, about 60 to 70% of patients who've got cirrhosis, they would have ascites. However, those of us who work in tertiary care centers, many of these patients who present with ascites, they can be a little challenging at times, as this case will bear out. So this is a real life situation, a patient that we saw not so long ago. So this is the story of Mr. Reddy, a 55-year-old male, history of occasional alcohol consumption and smoking, but he had been abstinent for almost half a year. He is known to have type 2 diabetes, which was diagnosed in 2011. He was initially on oral hypoglycemic agents, but at the time he reported to us, he was on insulin. In 2012, he had a road traffic accident with head injury, and he knew that he had been transfused with blood. In 2013, he had an episode of acute diarrheal illness which needed hospital attention, and at the same time, he was detected to be hepatitis C virus positive. He was not treated, though the treatment options were discussed with the patient, but he refused treatment on account of the side effect profile and low success rate. In 2018, for the first time, he had features of decompensated chronic liver disease in the form of pedal edema, abdominal distension, and shortness of breath. When he was evaluated for the same, he was told that he has cirrhosis with the presence of moderate ascites, and he had grade 3 esophageal varices with red signs present. At the same center where this evaluation was done, he was subjected to primary prophylaxis with band ligator, and he was also initiated on non-selective beta blockers, and this was in April of 2020. When he came to us, he had already had large ascites for about 4 to 6 weeks duration, and he had undergone a large volume paracentesis at an outside center. The ascitic fluid analysis report that he was carrying with him showed no evidence of spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, and after stabilization, he was referred to our center for consideration for liver transplantation. So this is not odd. So many a times when somebody has a large ascites, people would be inclined to refer them for transplant, but maybe what this case might bear out towards the end is that there might be a different approach to things. So I think, and anybody, Dr. Paul or Dr. Datta, can take up this question, that what do we think is happening to this patient? So this patient who has been known to have diabetes for less than a decade, and he was also evaluated some years ago following an acute diarrheal illness and also found to be hepatitis C positive, one putative insult in the form of a transfusion which had happened a year earlier. So what do we think? Do we think that it's what do we think is the etiology of the case and etiology of the liver disease, and what do you think brought about the decompensation?
Dr. Pal, you can take up.
Yes,
Dr.
sir. Oh,
Yes.
sorry. Yes. So what I feel is that probably it's a multifactorial etiology that is causing his decompensation, because as we know, NASH, he has been detected to be diabetes, though less than a decade, but he has also been occasional alcohol intake is also there, and he has developed hep C, though we don't know about his RNA status, whether it's active, inactive. So probably my feel would be that all these three have contributed, but most important, I think, whether he was being educated about this fluid restriction and salt, that is sodium restriction outside, and whether he was put on optimal diuretic regime, that is again not clear from the history, sir. Maybe the case records were missing. So I think a history of his diet intake, his sodium intake, as well as I think whether he was having the optimal diuretic regime, that is to stamp him as a case of refractory ascites, was there or not. This would be my analysis.
Right. So I think that point is well taken, that this probably is multifactorial, and this patient who's known to be a diabetic, and what I didn't mention, it will come subsequently in the examination, that his peak body weight was 90 kilos at some point in time, though of course in recent times he had lost weight, and the corrected BMI corrected for his ascites, large ascites as well as pedal edema, was still 28 when he reported to us. So I think Dr. Paul's point is well taken, that this is multifactorial. Probably the diabetes is the main culprit, and also this patient has at least he's overweight. And of course, there is the background hepatitis C, which we need to dwell on in a little greater detail. So what do we think might be the reason for decompensation?
Devashish, should you take that?
I just add one more point. When I see this patient, I always think about if there's any treatable cause of cirrhosis. So I think, to me, apart from alcohol, which is abstaining, and NAFLD, Hepatitis C, I would think, is something which is quite important. Reason for decompensation could be multifactorial here, whether he has had any infection which has triggered this, whether he has started drinking again, that's something which we need to think about, or if there's any bleed anywhere which he hasn't told us about. So these things we will look at.
Right. So I think your point is again well taken. So when somebody like this presents, and oftentimes in tertiary care centers, we will have a lot of competing diagnoses to contend with, and then you have to use your clinical judgment to see what really is the reason behind a very rapid deterioration in this patient's condition. So please remember that this has all happened or evolved over a period of 3 to 4 months. So it could be just the natural course of the illness. So we know that all compensated cirrhotics, they do decompensate, and that happens with a frequency of about 4 to 5% per year. Someone who's got NAFLD, NASH, and has also got background of hepatitis C, this could just be a natural progression of the illness. But at all times, one has to wonder about
HCC, I think also.
either
HCC may
thrombosis.
also be. HCC, what I'm saying is
Yeah, portal vein thrombosis and HCC. Yeah. So these are the two things which we should always keep at the back of our mind. And of course, the other thing is the use of non-selective beta blockers, which is again a very contentious issue. But this is again something which this patient had been initiated on in the recent times. So I think as clinicians, these are the various things that one would put one's mind to, that probably this is the reason for his decompensation over a relatively short period of time. The only
So,
thing, yeah, please go.
so, sir, I had a comment actually, because you are a authority on this liver disease, sir. Because this patient has actually had a primary prophylaxis with EVL, but he was also again put on NSBB.
Yes,
sir,
yes.
is this guideline based? I mean, or it was some, because as we know that if the patient is being, either it is, sir, we go on banding and you eradicate the varices as primary prophylaxis, or we put this patient on NSBB. So though there have been only one Chinese study which has, I mean Korean study, which was not actually published in a journal, which said that probably NSBB with EVL might have a role for primary prophylaxis. So because the DNB students are also listening to this seminar, sir, what is your actually take home message, at least regarding this primary prophylaxis?
Yeah, so I think even though what you are saying is absolutely correct, but many people, and when I see even patients coming from big centers, which are high volume for liver patients, if the patient has got high grade varices with red signs, as this patient had, and some features of advanced liver disease, there are many people who would be doing both of these two things together. I am not a huge proponent of that. I myself am still a strong believer of using non-selective beta blockers. So if this patient had first come up to me, I would have used that as my choice of primary prophylaxis. But I'm sure, and maybe someone very experienced like Dr. Konar can comment on this, but I oftentimes see people using both these two modalities together.
I think for primary prophylaxis, I would also support your views that normally we prescribe non-selective beta blockers most of the time, and unless there is some, as the problems with beta blockers like contraindications and patients have symptoms, or otherwise we would choose EVL. But EVL and beta blocker, we normally, as a routine, we do not recommend for primary prophylaxis. But sometimes I think the patients may miss a story of GI bleed, a black stool or something like that, if you have to inquire very strongly that these patients with red signs and all may have a history of melena in the distant past and all. And if there is a history, then I think it is probably better for secondary prophylaxis, both EVL and beta blocker. So
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
I would recommend definitely non-selective beta blocker, and and with ascites we usually avoid carvedilol. That's the two things I use.
Very quick comment. I personally think it's sometimes very difficult to follow the books and trials in India. So I think
That's right.
it is sometimes you do primary prophylaxis with banding, and possibly follow up with a beta blocker. I know what the books studies are saying, but sometimes the follow-ups are quite difficult, and I feel much happier if someone with large varices is on a beta blocker rather than waiting for them to come back for regular follow-up with a varicose.
Yeah,
That's
so I
my
think what Dr. Datta is saying is probably what is the general tempo you see in practice. So when the patient is with you, you go ahead and do something definitive, and then you're not sure whether this patient will come back to you, and just to play safe, you also start them on NSBB. So this is not uncommon at all. Only one more thing to add, that oftentimes, even as clinicians who see large volume of liver patients, we don't factor in the effect of diabetes. So what diabetes can do to progression of any kind of liver disease. So that is something which really misses the mark. And I think this is the correct forum to talk about this, because diabetes is known to accelerate the progression of all etiologies of liver disease. So whether it is hepatitis B or hepatitis C or alcohol-related liver disease, what have you, and diabetes, and it's been shown in elegant studies that the rate of fibrosis progression is 2 to 2.5 times higher if you also have diabetes. So I think this particular patient, even though, so if you were to say that hepatitis C was the primary thing, again, you have an infection which is very slowly progressive. And if you were to say that it is basically NAFLD NASH, again, the timelines don't fit. But when you have diabetes in a patient who also has a competing diagnosis, then you can really have a very rapid progression of liver disease as well as features of decompensation, probably, which is what this patient bears out. And always to remember that diabetes per se is a risk factor for not just HCC, but for a number of other malignancies. So when we examined this patient, we found that this patient was afebrile. His general physical examination was unremarkable except for mild pallor. He had pedal edema. His jugular venous pressure was normal. He didn't have any findings on the cardiovascular system, CNS system, and chest examination. And he had large ascites, and it was difficult to appreciate any hepatomegaly or splenomegaly. So this patient had grade 3 ascites, which means that this patient really had undergone a large volume thoracentesis just a while ago and still had rapidly reaccumulated this fluid in the belly. So I think the physical examination, in the interest of time, and everyone is very senior, so this basically tells you that this is an ascites which has rapidly come back. So this is a less than a week ago that this patient was tapped, and he's come back in again with grade 3 ascites. But like Dr. Paul said, we are not very sure whether he was adequately educated on sodium intake, and the prescriptions on the diuretic dosage and whatever was prescribed was also not readily available. The differential diagnosis, again, when someone has got a very rapid accumulation of ascites, like we mentioned earlier, you have to think on lines of portal vein thrombosis, or whether there is any liver tumor that has set in the backdrop of cirrhosis. And I think when somebody has a very rapid deterioration of their clinical course, these two things must always be looked at. And any comments from Dr. Datta or Dr. Paul?
Sir, could we think of Budd-Chiari syndrome here? Though I do understand that there is no history of any pain abdomen, and also the physical examination doesn't say there is any back veins. So because there was a rapid accumulation of ascites, should we go for a Doppler study of the ultrasound here to just to make a DD about the different diagnoses? That what we have. Can we put in Budd-Chiari here?
Right. So point well taken. We know that cirrhosis in most instances is a prothrombotic state rather than an antithrombotic state. But when we talk of rapid deterioration, it's almost always that we are talking of the inflow disorders, because we know that this patient has got well and truly established firm, scarred, D-shaped, misshapen liver. And probably that is something that one would keep at the back of the mind, but not something as a forerunner as a diagnosis.
I've got a quick question, Dr. Kapoor. If there is no financial problem and if the GFR is okay, would you do a CT in these cases to look for small HCCs or even portal vein thrombosis?
Right. So again, when the patient first comes to us, for me, it's always been a good quality ultrasound, and we do not get the ultrasound done by anybody. So so we have got only 2 sonologists who do the liver ultrasounds. And if we find that somebody has got some findings which are equivocal on ultrasound, then quickly. So for example, if in a patient like this, I find that the alpha fetoprotein is something that I'm not able to put my finger on, I would quickly, transit to a cross-sectional imaging. But the first test on almost all occasions would be an ultrasound only, but done by a dedicated sonologist. I do concede that there are many centers who would do a cross-sectional imaging right at the outset. All right, so obviously this was a question, like I said right at the outset, posted for postgraduates. So, and this is something that they are very commonly asked in the exam, that you have a choice of limited lab data. What would you need to manage this patient? And therefore, in the interest of time, I'll just go through this. So these are the basic things that we need for any patient. And I'm sure that there are fellows also who've logged in, or I hope they have logged in. So this is something that you need in any patient with chronic liver disease, so that you will be able to at least know what the etiology of the liver disease is, supposing if it is viral etiology, what the cause of ascites is, whether there is something to worry about on a sonology examination, as also to give them a liver disease severity score. So you could choose your liver disease severity score, whether it's the Child-Pugh score or whether it is the MELD score, which is what we use more often now. But for all fellows in training who might be listening in, so this is something that we should have. So not everybody has the all the high flying tests at their disposal, but this is the basic thing that we must do in every single patient. And in this list you also see the ascitic fluid analysis. So first time any patient who comes to us with decompensation and this ascites has not been evaluated, we must always analyze the ascites just to make sure that it's not something that we are overlooking. And maybe if time permits, towards the end we can talk of the various kinds of, or the various varieties of ascites that you can encounter even in a chronic liver disease patient. Are we okay here, Dr. Paul, Dr. Datta?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I think, sir, I would just add one thing is that could we go for a, sir, because you have said that you stress so much upon diabetes, actually. So could we go for a urine analysis for, urine sodium and urine albumin creatinine ratio? I mean,
yes, sir. So that's the next slide.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this is what his basic lab data showed. So the slightly elevated white cell count, platelets are low, INR of 1.9. As you can see, the AST to ALT ratio is reversed. He's got total proteins of 7.3 and an albumin of 2.9, and sodium 134, still okay. Urea 44 and a creatinine of 0.6. On the right side, if we see, the MELD is 15, MELD sodium of 19, and a Child-Pugh score of 9B. The sonologist told us that this patient has a small shrunken liver with coarse echos. There was no SOL. There was no portal vein thrombosis. The portal vein measured 14 millimeters with hepatopedal flow of 14 centimeter per second. There was gross ascites and there was no splenomegaly. So I think we have a rough idea, and now all of us know that we generally use in patients who've got decompensated chronic liver disease the MELD sodium score. This is also now the accepted score even in the Western world, where you are now allocating organs not based on the MELD score but in the MELD sodium score. And especially people who've got large ascites, they typically have low MELD scores, and therefore for those of us who are interested in transplant, we should always make sure that we are calculating the MELD sodium rather than the MELD score. So this is what the ascitic fluid analysis was like. There was no evidence of spontaneous bacterial peritonitis. Tuberculosis is extremely common, and it's already been mentioned that this patient did give history of alcohol intake, which was occasional, but you never know because this history at times could be fallacious. So we must always look for TB, more common in alcohol etiology, but it's not as if to say it does not occur in other etiologies of chronic liver disease. We again was subjected to a large volume paracentesis. The virus screening was negative, and we removed about 5.5 liters of fluid under albumin cover. And so this is what Dr. Paul was mentioning. So this is what we did. So this patient, because he's a diabetic of long standing, you always, so even though you saw a creatinine value of 0.6, so please remember that there are two ways of defining chronic kidney injury. One is with the help of estimated GFR, and the other is also with the help of proteinuria. So there are two distinct equations of assessment of renal failure. And this is something which, again, I would like to send this message loud and clear. Oftentimes we only look at the creatinine values and we look at the eGFR by whatever formula we are used to using. Most of us use the Cockcroft-Gaul formula, but please remember that metabolic syndrome, its components, diabetes is extremely common in chronic liver disease patients that we see. Oftentimes their sugar values and the A1C would not even suggest that this patient is a diabetic. So again, this is something that we are oftentimes found guilty of, that we will go with the fasting blood sugar values or A1C values. So both of these could be normal in cirrhotic population and still they might be diabetic. So it's extremely important to do this test all the time. This test is also very relevant when you are subjecting your patients to transplant evaluation, because following transplant, when the patients would be on immunosuppression, this urine spot protein to creatinine ratio will come to your aid in deciding what immunosuppression to use in a patient who's got a slightly iffy renal function. So urine spot sodium of 20. So this is the time, Dr. Paul, he is not on any diuretics and his urine spot sodium is 20 and he's had now 2 large volume paracentesis in less than a fortnight. The hepatitis C RNA quantitative was 1.2 million, genotype was 1A, and the alpha fetoprotein was 3.7. Any comments from your side, sir?
Yes, sir. So I think one thing to remember is that as we say that Hep C, sir, can also, along with diabetes, can have some influence upon the renal function. But again, we don't have the urinary, actually the hematuria, whether there was some hematuria, whether there whatever.
Sediment was unremarkable.
Yeah. Sediment was unremarkable. Okay, sir. Okay, sir. So maybe I think we should go for treatment of sir, this hepatitis C, because it is a genotype 1A. Sir, I think at least we could try treatment here, and his creatinine was more or less normal, at least the serum creatinine. So I think the usual we can use here. At least he is not CKD, so I think we can use treatment here.
All right. So I would like to highlight the point that his MELD score is 15 and a MELD sodium of 19. Dr. Datta, any comments from your side regarding looking for any evidence of Hep C related renal damage, and B, an intent to treat the chronic hepatitis C?
I agree with Bhaskar. I think I will possibly treat hepatitis. But I also wanted to know, was he on any diuretics? I missed that thing.
So ever since he was with us and he had come from another center, first seen in the outpatient department and then subsequently admitted, he was not. So he was, at least for all practical purposes, not on diuretics for about a week.
Because I was thinking whether he is taking, restricting the fluid and the salt intake. So that's why I asked this question. I tend to agree. I think with this, I will treat him for hepatitis C with the well and soft regime, because I think there is what I said initially, that if something can be cured, there is definite evidence that curing hepatitis C might help in its cirrhosis. So though it's multifactorial, I tend to probably treat this patient.
Right.
Dr. Dharmesh, are you considering transplant at all? I mean, what I'm saying
was referred for transplant. So I think we'll just allow the story to unfold. So this patient was specifically referred, and that too by a practicing GI colleague. So it was not referred from a physician.
I'm just asking because the treatment for HCV is distinctly related to the timing of transplant, pre, peri, and post, and all that kind of sort of things. So I think if we know in our mind that he is a candidate for transplant, then accordingly we can decide the timing of treatment, and obviously the regime is practically same. I mean, it doesn't change much, but I think the timing of treatment for HCV again depends on the timing with transplant. I mean,
that's a super point that you make, sir. So just going back a little to what Dr. Paul said a little while ago. So when we start thinking on hepatitis C related renal dysfunction, the most important parameter is the serum creatinine value. Then you look at the spot protein to creatinine ratio, because oftentimes collecting 24 hours urine is not very easy in day-to-day practice. And then you look at the urine sediment. So these are the three things. Most of the times you will also see these patients having slightly higher blood pressure values than you would expect in people who've got otherwise decompensated chronic liver disease. And then of course a very detailed examination to see. So you know, in the dark skin it's not very easy to see the mottling of livedo reticularis, but you should look definitely for any features of neuropathy or any rash. So these are the things for the fellows in training who might have logged in. However, it's very important that we should bear this point in mind, that hepatitis C itself can produce a primary glomerular injury. Now, again, coming back to what Dr. Sogananda Konar said a little while ago, and that point is hugely important and it's worth emphasizing again and again. So, supposing I am contemplating transplant for this patient, and maybe I can pose this question again to Dr. Paul and Dr. Datta, because they were both concurring on the fact that this patient should be treated. So, supposing this patient is a candidate for transplant, so you know his MELD score is suggesting that, his MELD sodium is suggesting that, he's already needed 2 sessions of large volume paracentesis. So the stage is set, you know, for, and he has a fair degree of portal hypertension as we've seen. So the stage is set for, and it's not inappropriate for the referring doctor to refer him for transplant. So supposing we decide that we have to transplant him, so would you want to treat him now or would you want to treat him after transplant?
So I would like to treat this patient before transplant, because sir, I would be happy that at least when he is going for transplant in a as low viral sir, load as possible. If it is, say, we have a, say, 4 weeks at least a window. So if by that period, if his at least if his RNA levels are near about 0 or something like that, I think the the post transplant scenario would be much better, because in the past we when we didn't have much this well suited or well tolerated treatment for hep C, something known as fibrosing cholestatic hepatitis used to occur when these hep C patients and all this, they were subjected to I think to these immunosuppressants. So I would be very happy if they are going to a transplant in as low a viral load as possible, sir. That is my take, sir.
Right. Dr. Datta, what would you say?
I look at it a different way. First of all, my question is, does this patient need transplant now? How urgent it is? Now, if I look at him, I know his MELD sodium is 19, but we haven't yet proven that he has got resistant ascites, because he hasn't been treated properly yet. He hasn't got encephalopathy. His albumin is good. His creatinine, I know there is spotty urine kidney, it's not too bad. I will definitely treat him now and see if things improve, because MELD might improve and he may not need transplant in the long term. I do understand the question of NASH and alcohol, but I will treat him first.
Right. So supposing, let me just twist this a little, and I would probably agree with you on this. So I think the way we would want to predicate your treatment in a patient like this would be to see if by clearing or achieving an SVR, the MELD would come down. Supposing I were to say that this patient has got a genotype 3B, would your views be any different?
I will still have a go. I think I know where you're coming from, but I think that things do change with the successful.
Okay, so now because I'm presenting the case, I'll tell you my viewpoint. So whenever somebody like this comes, I never ever am in a hurry to treat patients who have got decompensation and who've got MELDs which are slightly in excess of 16. That is so there is no one firm MELD that tells you whether you should be treating these patients with decompensated chronic hepatitis C or not. But that is the threshold that I have. Even if this MELD were to be much lower, anyone who's got an albumin which is less than 3, a sodium which is not a good 135 plus, I always wait. So I'm never in a rush. So if this patient were indeed someone who's got no money whatsoever even to come to a hospital or the kind of practice that I have, I would still not be wanting to treat him. I would spend some good few weeks with him before I take that call. And definitely, if this patient is not for transplant and quote unquote he behaves himself in the next 3 to 4 weeks that I have managed him, I would be keen to treat him. So the message that I want to convey is, and this is, and I don't know, because this is something which I am very, very fond of presenting. You know, what are the DAs? DAs are all mitochondrial toxins. So when people have got decompensated chronic liver disease, the DAs can precipitate or worsen liver failure. So one has to be extremely cautious. Even with the newer drugs like Sofwelpa, many of us have burnt our fingers, and that might necessitate an urgent transplant. So I am not saying that this patient is not treatable, but I would not treat him at this stage. I would want to see how his ascites is behaving, how he behaves when I treat him with diuretics, what happens to his electrolytes, and what happens to his mental status while we are managing him on the sidelines, not on DAs, and then take a call on giving him the DA therapy. So that is what I would do every single time. I don't know whether I've been able to put
Dr. Dharmesh,
the point.
that if this patient has a higher MELD, I think the waiting should always be near to transplant rather than treating. Say if he has a MELD score of say 25
Ji, sir.
or MELD sodium, then
So anything
probably
which is beyond 21 is out. So that is what the guidance documents also say. So you know the problem occurs between 16 to 20. So
20, yes, that
yeah,
is MELD score.
yeah, but we've all seen, and I don't know, sir, whether one time Professor Zoism came to our country and I had presented the case of a doctor's mother, and who was somebody, and everybody in the audience said we would treat, and that lady went on to develop acute on chronic liver failure. I'm not saying that everybody develops that, but unless you have a plan B in mind. So what I learned, and this was almost 6-7 years ago, is that whenever you have a patient like this, always spend time with them, because the DA is very straightforward, you know. So if this patient's ascites were to behave itself, he would respond to diuretics, he would not drop his sodium, his creatinine would not go up. Certainly, I would want to treat him. And I quite appreciate Dr. Datta's point that maybe by treating him and clearing his hepatitis C, you might achieve a situation when, you know, his decompensation also gets better. But probably at this point in time, this moment in time, I would not treat him. I would like to spend some more time. So this patient was initiated on diuretic therapy, and again, this is more for the fellows in training who've logged in. So I think oftentimes even those who work in academic institutions, they would be a little off the mark when it comes to diuretic therapy. So Dr. Paul, would you just quickly state, sir, what should be the regular diuretic therapy like in a patient with decompensated chronic liver disease?
Sir, at least though we should start with, you know, sir, so that is the furosemide, as well as, you know, that is spironolactone, in actually not in a combination form, rather separately. And my practice would be to, sir, to build up the dose gradually. I mean, rather than, you know, putting this patient on a very high dose of furosemide, very high dose of spironolactone, and thereby precipitating lot of electrolyte abnormalities, is better, as you said, we want to spend some time with the patient to look whether he's you know, progressing to certain complications of diuretic therapy. So maybe I would start with, say, 20 milligram of spironolactone, 20 milligram of furosemide, and maybe 50 milligram of that is spironolactone, and then maybe if, every 4 or 5 days, maybe we assess the body weight as well as his then accordingly increase the dose. That would be my policy, sir. At least in this type of unstable patients where, you know, they might go both ways.
Right. Dr. Datta, what would be your policy, sir, in a patient like this?
I tend to agree, but I will use the same medication, but I usually use slightly higher dose. I would probably go for 40 and 100, but patient needs to be monitored very closely with weight and the necessary blood tests. But I also put stress on the fluid and the sodium intake. I think that's sometimes quite difficult to control, but combination of these. So I also use spironolactone and furosemide separately. I probably use slightly higher dose than 50 and 20.
So anything to choose between furosemide and torsemide?
No, I personally always have used furosemide. So I usually stick to what I use.
Right.
Okay, but what just I would mention is that maybe sometimes I do use torsemide because at least during these times, many of Dr. Konar's patients are being seen by me, and Dr. Konar is a fan of torsemide. So if it is his patients that I am seeing, I would sir go with torsemide rather than furosemide.
Sure.
I think I would say that furosemide should be the first choice, and if
Yes.
it's not successful weight-wise, then we can replace it with torsemide, something like
Yes.
that. It's arbitrary, but I think that there may be a point in keeping torsemide for non-response to furosemide.
Right. So I think the point one would want to make for the sake of the fellows in training is that in patients with cirrhotic ascites, never use loop diuretics as the first choice of diuretic, because the
Obviously.
most important pathophysiologic reason why these patients are accumulating fluid is because of a state of hyperaldosteronism.
Yes.
If you have someone, and in any state, if you've got hyperaldosteronism and you know that works much more distally than where the loop diuretics act. So even if you were to give them loop diuretics, if there is a state of heightened
Second choice,
aldosterone secretion, these people will tend to accumulate or reabsorb more sodium, and in the process they will have a much worse ascites. So always it is the distal acting diuretic first, and either you use a combination with a loop diuretic or you start off with spironolactone, and then you can have your choice of either furosemide or torsemide. Not much to choose between the two of them, except that torsemide is a tad more expensive than furosemide. Ashokananda Konar sir, would you like to comment anything, sir?
Not really. I think we must stress on the use of spironolactone. That's the
Because still many
only-
times, especially because the
Yes.
nephrology colleagues are so fond of using loop diuretics.
Yeah, I think if there's not a contraindication like hyperkalemias and all that, I think the benchmark should be spironolactone.
Right.
Then
And
we add up the other things.
Dr. Paul, how in your practice do you monitor the response to diuretic therapy, sir?
Sir, usually it is through body weight measurement at a fixed time of the day. This is number one, and second would be, sir, if they are if they are financially well off, maybe, sir, also to look at the spot sodium and to see whether exactly and how much sir, tapping he is required. Because if somebody is saying that he is on strict diuretics, he is on this sodium restricted diet, but he is requiring every 2 weeks a large volume paracentesis. Obviously, it means that either he is non-compliant or there are some problems. And if he has got a high sodium, that is excretion in the urine, but again he is requiring repeated paracentesis, I would suggest that again we go back, as Dr. Datta stressed, that we educate the patient regarding especially sodium restriction.
Right. Dr. Datta, what plan do you follow?
See, I follow the similar weight, but one thing which is sometimes very difficult to do at times, 24-hour urinary sodium collection. I find it quite useful before, but unfortunately for several reasons can't be done all the time. But if the urinary sodium is low, and if the urinary sodium is high, so that makes a difference whether the patient is actually taking proper diuretic, which is responsive, or are they tolerating or taking excess sodium. So if the diuretic is working properly and if there is weight loss, then they are not diuretic resistant. But if the sodium is low and there is no weight loss, then there is possibly diuretic resistance is coming in. So I think checking 24-hour urinary sodium is very useful. Often it cannot be done. In that case, urinary sodium and potassium is also quite relevant.
Yeah.
So if the sodium is less compared to the potassium, there is a question of diuretic resistance comes in.
Yeah.
Right. So I think this is again a very, very valid point for those, not just the trainees, but also those who practice hepatology on a day-to-day basis, that the simplest thing to do is to keep a daily weight record. So tell the patient that after he's taken a shower every single day, he should check his weight. if the weight is falling down on diuretic therapy, and checking 24 hours urine output is very cumbersome for everyone. It's very difficult even in hospital-based settings, but even more difficult on domiciliary basis. So then you know that your patient is responsive to diuretics. And like Dr. Paul said, when the patient comes back to the clinic, you check the urine sodium values. So if someone is having high urinary sodium excretion, but at the same time losing weight, then you know that this patient is diuretic responsive. If this patient is having low sodium values and gaining weight, then you know that this patient might be diuretic resistant. So these are the two situations that you must really want to know. And like Dr. Datta said, that a good surrogate is the sodium to potassium ratio. So if the sodium to potassium ratio is greater than 1, then you know that this patient is excreting at least the amount of sodium he is ingested, which is generally 80 millimoles. So this is the advice that we give most of our patients, that they should take at least this much amount of sodium in the day. So 2 to 3 grams is the regular advice that we give to our patients. And it's very important to also mention at this stage that if you try to restrict the sodium intake very severely, that actually has a negative impact on the clinical course of cirrhotics. So they tend to not get adequate calories, and this has been shown to actually worsen their short to medium term outcomes. So about that much amount of salt we should permit to our patients. So message: amount, daily weight record, and the amount of sodium in the urine. So 1 week after toracimide 10 milligrams and spironolactone 50 milligrams, the patient reports to the outpatient department with 1.5 kg weight gain. So what do we do next? And this has already been answered in the preceding discussion. We requested for his urine electrolytes as well as what was going on in the blood works, and we find that the urine spot sodium. So spot sodium at baseline was 20. It is 18 now on diuretics, and he's been compliant. Serum sodium values have dropped from 134 to 128, and the creatinine, which was 0.6, has gone up to 1.3. So any comments on this?
Sir, I think he is developing this diuretic complications, and probably we will need to think of other like repeated large volume paracentesis, or maybe we can consider tips. But again, because he's a transplant candidate, specifically he has been here. But also another point, his MELD so sodium score is quite high. It's above 18. So probably again tips would not be very advisable here.
Right.
Now, would you stop diuretics?
Sorry?
Yes, sir. I think we would like to stop diuretics here, because his creatinine has shot up by more than 2 times almost. So I think definitely we should stop diuretics at this point of time and follow him with
probably think of HRS here.
HRS, yeah.
So if we were one was to be very, very strict, so you know this patient has had a 2-fold increase, so this would be akin to. But having said that, for that definition to be incorporated into the patient management, we would have to make sure that this patient is off diuretics. So you cannot use that definition unless somebody has been off diuretics at least for 48 hours.
48 hours.
Suffices to say, and this is again brings us back to the same point which was I was trying to make a little while earlier, that any patient like this, I would never be in a rush to treat their underlying viral hepatitis. So this is something, supposing this patient had also been started on DAs, you know, this would also be a stage when you would want to then tweak the doses of the nukes that you are using. So that is why I always feel that you should spend some time with the patient and see what course the disease is taking before we embark upon the DA therapy. Dr. Konar sir, any comments from your side, sir?
No, I think I was just saying that initially, that as I said, the learning point is to stop diuretic. See what happens, where we are, and then decide either LBP or with albumin versus, you know, other ways of looking at refractory ascites.
Right.
And to exclude or confirm HRS.
So I think for confirming HRS, we'll have to make sure that we've started the diuretics. So, you know, many a times there will be those, and this is not uncommon, and I'm sure you also see this in your practice, that if somebody is gaining weight, everybody will say that the lab reference range is 1.6. let me increase the diuretic dose further. So this is something that one should not be doing. So in a patient like this, we should completely be very, very wary of using the diuretic. Many people would also want to change the diuretic type. I'm sure you would be seeing this scenario in your practice too. So somebody would
Yes.
probably give them another loop diuretic in the evening because lay 6. So they think that indeed this is something which works only for 6 hours, and let me give another dose to see whether this patient would then start to diurese well. Domiciliary albumin is again something that sir mentioned, and there are studies and evidence to suggest that if you were to use albumin in this patient, then maybe this patient, it might hasten his recovery of renal parameters. And then of course, let's have a discussion on this. So what would be one's take on using something like midodrine in a situation like this?
So one thing that I would like to first see that his creatinine values comes down, because midodrine, though it's a splanchnic vasoconstrictor, but it can also can cause renal vasoconstriction. So I'd be very happy to see first withdraw his diuretics, see the creatinine. That's my policy, to see this thing come down. And maybe, sir, I would combine, if the patient is hospitalized, sir, midodrine with albumin and maybe octride, if his creatinine is going up. But if his creatinine is going up, I'd be happy with to treat him with only with midodrine, because I have got certain bad experiences with midodrine regarding, though I mean I didn't find it in the literature. So maybe we can come to it later. So my idea would be to start midodrine after his creatinine values comes down, and then only I would like to be happy with midodrine, sir.
Dr. Datta sir, what's
I tend to agree. I won't rush and do anything, but I look at the map. So my aim is try to keep the map above 80 if we can. So if the patient is hypertensive with a low map, I do consider midodrine in these cases. But I would agree with Bhaskar. Should not rush and do anything. See what happens after stopping the diuretics. But if the patient has a low map, then I will consider midodrine.
right? So I think the point well taken. We probably all concur that either you should reduce or stop the diuretics altogether to make sure that you see a decline in the serum creatinine value. Even the sodium has changed from 134 to 128, which is again something that one should be mindful of. So we know that this patient has worse portal hypertension than what we imagined he has. Albumin, if this patient were to be willing for hospitalization, so probably what I would do is to stop diuretic, give him albumin, and see whether things would be hastened, and then at the time of discharge, take a call whether he would be a candidate for a lower diuretic therapy along with midodrine. But coming to your point of map, uh, I oftentimes find patients already to have a baseline map which is more than 75. So I know that this map is something that the midodrine and the terlipressin literature talks about oftentimes. So this patient still does not qualify the label of a HRS. So how often do you see a low map in patients with a situation like this? So this is not HRS because we know that we have not stopped diuretics. So when this patient's diuretics were stopped, this patient's creatinine again came back to near normal. It didn't become the same as it was at baseline, but it again came back to a value of 1.1. So what would you do? So supposing if this patient's map was 75, would you then refrain from starting midodrine?
I think what I would possibly do is, if the creatine has come back to normal, start a lower dose of diuretic and monitor it closely. But I am I think albumin therapy, if it can be given in addition at home also, maybe twice a week or once a week even. I think the study is mainly with twice a week initially and then once a week. I would try albumin and diuretics again, keeping an eye on the blood pressure. But I personally think that if the blood pressure falls, if there's an evidence of hypotension or low MAP, then midodrine will possibly work in addition. So albumin and diuretics.
So if someone has got a normal MAP, you would be averse to using midodrine?
Well, the evidence, as far as I know, is midodrine can be added, not a problem. But MAP, if the MAP is more than, I can't remember the exact figure, 82, I think, as the study says, then the role of midodrine is not very clear. If the MAP is below 75 or 70, I think the evidence is more stronger.
Right. So I would just like to make a comment here that, most of the traditional studies on the use of vasoconstrictors have been done in the era of typical alcohol cirrhotics. So patients who were, sarcopenic, hardly had any muscle mass, the typical decompensated cirrhotic, when you try to picture him in your mind. So these are the people who've got systolic pressures of 90 to 100. Now that we are contending more and more with people with the metabolic syndrome and NAFLD-NASH, even you would see that patients who got a frank HRS1. So when we were in training, what was taught to us is that an HRS1, you can look at the monitor and diagnose that. But I don't think that is true in this day and age. So you see patients who've got much higher values of pressure, but we do not know what his baseline pressure was. So that was the point I was trying to make. So supposing if this patient's MAP comes out as 75, but I do not know that when he was well, his MAP was actually 85. So I think that should be a very soft point in telling us that we cannot use a vasoconstrictor. So the pathophysiology of an ascites like this certainly is splanchnic vasodilatation, and there is pooling in the splanchnic circulation, and I think a splanchnic vasoconstrictor would work. Having said that, there is a caveat that you should also assess the cardiac function in them very carefully. So I think what we as practitioners need to now get into that mold, that we should not say that a MAP of less than 65 and I would use a vasoconstrictor. So you could be having a MAP of more than 75 also. If you were to use a vasoconstrictor, just be wary of the cardiac status. And if the cardiac status is good, then probably it is worthwhile to use a vasoconstrictor. That is what we follow on our unit. Dr. Konar, can I have your comments on this, sir?
I think two things. Number one, I think measuring the blood pressure can be an endpoint. Like, you titrate the dose of midodrine unless definitely, the 2.5 three times a day, 7.5 three times a day, 12.5 three times a day. It all has to be titrated. And a particular blood pressure value may not be important, but if you follow the patient, I think, as you said, that vasoconstrictors would certainly would be of help in each patient, but whether they have other side effects, I think it needs to be looked at, like, cardiac output and all. But I think if we give midodrine and if we look at the other parameters, then we would all see that there would be some improvement, like in plasma aldosterone, plasma renin, and all that kind of scenario. So I think, but during the titration of the dosage, I think that looking at the blood pressure and the MAP may be of help. But it should not be, I think it's more important is to see that the patient is non-azotemic. That is one. Most of the trials and have said that not to use it when the serum creatinine is above 2. I think that may be another factor that one has to keep in mind.
Right. So I
mostly
think,
non-azotemic patients, not subsequently.
So I think again you made a very valid point. I feel that our experience has been that these drugs work well when you are having only a difficult to manage ascites, but not a frank HRS NACI physiology. So if you are having an HRS NACI physiology, non-AKI physiology, then probably these drugs do not work as well as they do when you have only a difficult to manage ascites. So that is what I feel has been our experience. So obviously there are a number of other things that you can try, and Dr. Datta did mention that a domiciliary albumin and stopping diuretics in this particular patient might be a valid option. So I think this patient refused to get hospitalized. His diuretic dose was reduced to half. He was initiated on midodrine 5 milligrams thrice daily and domiciliary albumin 40 grams per week to see what it would do to the management of his ascites, as well as what would be borne out by the renal functions on follow-up. This patient returned 2 weeks later with a weight gain of 4 kgs. He was short of breath. The ascites was again grade 3 on examination, and he was saturating 88% on room air. So what do you think is going on?
Sir, I think though number one is we should look into whether because of the shortness of breath, large ascites, whether he's developing any hepatic hydrothorax or not. So my thing would be to go for a chest X-ray, and also as you rightly mentioned, sir, whether what is his cardiovascular status. That is a good quality echocardiogram and maybe a cardiology refer also. So I think these are the thing, and maybe we should think about hepatopulmonary because, as you said, he was quite a advanced liver disease patient. So, but again, this large ascites and all those things. So maybe hepatopulmonary would come third. So maybe hepatic hydrothorax, any cardiological issues, and lastly, sir, hepatopulmonary. These
Yeah,
would
so
be
I
my
would tend
things.
to agree. So I think even for those who are in training, this is very,
Cirrhotic
very important.
cardiomyopathy.
With large,
Yes, cardiomyopathy. Huh?
yeah, so large ascites who present with shortness of breath, you should always think whether this ascites has trickled into the chest. So these were the labs that were requested. So as we know, we've reduced his dose of diuretic. His creatinine has come down from 1.3 to 1.1. The serum sodium value has gone up from 128 to 130, and the urine sodium remains low. And this is what his chest X-ray looked like. So Dr. Paul hit the nail on the head. As you can see, he's developed almost an significant effusion on the right side. So this is a right hepatic hydrothorax. And just like you always want to sample the ascitic fluid, we sampled the pleural fluid also. And again, it was suggestive of this being only a hepatic hydrothorax. So what would be the next plan of management? Dr. Datta, would you
I
like?
think now you have no other option but to consider tips.
Right.
You may have to consider with the advent of hepatic hydrothorax in this current scenario
Ji.
and transplant in the waiting, maybe that can be a bridge to transplant.
Right. So now no takers for
But-
treatment of hepatitis C. I think this.
No, I think he's quite unstable, and so he's actually the other pathophysiology based management would be much better rather than going for a etiological management here, as you very rightly stressed earlier. So I think maybe I would defer the treatment of CHC till his ascites and all those things are controlled, because he's quite dyspneic and all those. So maybe tips we'd be seriously considering ruling out infection. I mean, we have ruled out, sir.
Sure.
Yeah. So maybe tips.
And initiate liver transplant.
Initiate the liver transplant evaluation. Definitely, sir. Definitely.
Sure. Sure. Something else. So I think the panel is almost unanimous. So we have firmly come to the conclusion that this patient is diuretic resistant. There is no doubt about that. He is not responding to diuretics. His urine sodium levels remain very low. Even when we tried to escalate the diuretic to a minuscule dose, which was toracamide 10 and spironolactone 50, his biochemistry, it just went through the roof. And therefore, it probably makes sense now not even to use that half a tablet that he was given. He has had a partial response to the vasoconstrictor treatment, as was borne out by the serum sodium values and the creatinine values. But obviously, the primary target was not achieved. So we were not able to manage his ascites well. And that something else probably would be a tips. So we did get a thorough cardiac examination done on him. So it was negative for inducible ischemia. And like Dr. Paul said, in any patient who undergoes transplant evaluation, we always do a bubble echo to see whether there is any suggestion of hepatopulmonary syndrome. So this patient had good LV systolic function. Of course, diastolic dysfunction is also extremely important in these patients. But whenever we are planning to do tips in any patient, we have to be extremely confident of how the heart is going to take this,
Yes.
because he is a diabetic of almost 7-8 years duration. So I think these patients, they do deserve a very, very thorough cardiac evaluation.
Can I ask you a quick question, Raghav?
Yeah.
What's your cutoff for ejection fraction for tips? Because, with the, usually they have high ejection fractions, don't they? 70, 75%, especially in these patients. Is there a cutoff you have for tips?
So if the cardiologist were to tell me, so I know what you're trying to allude to. You're talking about heart failure with preserved ejection fraction.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think again, when you've, and of course, in the interest of time, I have not mentioned this. Many of our patients would also be subjected to cardiopulmonary exercise testing, which is a far more astute way of assessing the cardiopulmonary reserve. But if somebody has been looking at the hearts in patients who undergo transplant evaluation, we would buy their thing. So we always do the physiologic test also, like the 6-minute walk test. We get concerned if somebody is deconditioned, frail, which this patient clearly wasn't. Anything less than 55, one would not be very happy to accept for a TIPS procedure, because this is definitely going to have a huge load on the heart. So this again, now for the trainees who might have tuned in. So a cross-sectional imaging is always done when you want to do this procedure. And what you are very rarely looking at is what is the hepatic vein anatomy, what is the portal vein anatomy, what is the hepatic artery status. So again, this is something that we don't talk about. So people who've
So
got
buffer response.
yeah, so established portal hypertension, you should be able to. So please remember that in TIPS, you are diverting the portal flow. So the liver ought to receive its inflow from some source. So if you see a hypertrophied hepatic artery, you feel little good about someone who's being subjected to TIPS. Always make sure that this patient doesn't have any biliary dilatation, you're not having any hepatic cysts or masses. Always look at the collateral circulation, because this is a patient in whom we are trying to talk of refractory ascites, but please remember TIPS is oftentimes done for bleeding patients also, and the degree of ascites, because if you do not tap this ascites or pigtail the belly a day prior to the TIPS, the procedure becomes almost impossible, because the liver will keep moving and the interventional radiologist would not be able to do his job well. So this is the checklist which one can always keep at the back of our mind when we are subjecting a patient to TIPS.
So a quick question to you, sir, regarding these collaterals. Sir, while we are doing the TIPS, do you routinely embolize these collaterals?
So if somebody is bleeding, then yes. So if someone is bleeding, but we know that the moment your portoatrial gradient falls, many a times these collaterals, they diminish in size. But when you are doing TIPS for, say, somebody who's got gastric varices, then it's almost the norm to also embolize these vessels, either with the sclerosant or with the coils. So that is what one would do.
And so would it help in, I mean, if we embolize the collateral, so would it help in, diminishing the incidence of hepatic encephalopathy? I mean, your experience, sir, because obviously.
Right. So there are certain features which would tell you that in a given patient there might be a greater likelihood of hepatic encephalopathy. The most important denominator in these patients is the diameter to which you dilate the stent. So I think this is something, and you should have a regular chat with your IR guy, that you are not looking at somebody getting very flamboyant. So we only want the portoatrial gradient to drop by, say, 50% for a refractory ascites, and no more than that. So I would always err on the side of a slight under dilatation of the stent, rather than go overboard just to think that this patient should not start complaining that my ascites has not got sorted out. So I would always err on the side of under dilatation of the tract. So just a quick recap on what has happened in the last 3 weeks or so. So as has been already said by the expert panelists, that MELD and MELD sodium is very critical to our choice of deciding on TIPS. So traditionally, patients with Child-Pugh C are not suggested for TIPS, but that cutoff in most studies is 12C. As regards the MELD score, so there is a moderate risk when you are doing TIPS for patients with a MELD score of between 13 and 18. So this patient's MELD was 15, and on the 23rd, when he was then taken up for TIPS, it was 13. So mind you, these scores in the TIPS studies have not looked at MELD sodium. They have looked at only the traditional MELD score. So this patient would still be a low risk candidate for HT. But like I said, the most important determinant is the size to which you dilate the stent. So these are his numbers, and as you can see, not much has changed, except that we suddenly saw a blip in his enzyme. So one has to be very careful when these patients are subjected to TIPS, but because remember that he's got very high viral load. So we really do not know what is going on over here. And therefore, this patient has to be very carefully managed after the TIPS procedure. So he underwent TIPS procedure under conscious sedation. You can use general anesthesia also, but in our unit we use conscious sedation. The standard indications for the procedure and the absolute contraindications. So I think we've already crossed a lot of time. In the interest of time, I would just quickly ask the panelists about this. Dr. Paul, would you like to take this?
Yes, sir. Indications for TIPS would be, sir, at least in this patient or in refractory ascites cases, especially if they are requiring, sir, more than 2 paracentesis per month, which this patient was requiring. Sir, again, if the patient develops a loculated ascites, if they are intolerant of repeated paracentesis, and definitely, sir, refractory ascites with hepatic hydrothorax. So I think these are the few features of, ascites patients requiring a TIPS insertion.
Right.
And as you rightly pointed out, sir, patient selection is very important. Keeping in mind his cardiac status, his MELD status, any history of hepatic encephalopathy. And one point which we tend to forget is about the sepsis, including his dental health. As you know, a lot of studies from this dental health and cirrhotic mortality and post-TIPS, event developing, that is this shunt carditis, all those things, shuntitis. So these are a few points that I would like to stress. And contraindications, so as you have, sir, already put on that cardiac status, pulmonary hypertension. Sir, you get that checklist that whether there is any biliary obstruction, hepatic masses, especially cysts. And also, sir, I think portal vein thrombosis, and all these are certain relative contraindications. Even HCC is a relative contraindications, and age definitely is an important point because we need to discuss with the patient party. Yes, sir.
So I think that's superb. I think you've just nailed it, and
Yes,
it's very, very important to make sure that this patient is not having an upswing of the white cell count. Look at the inflammatory marker, whatever you are comfortable with, because this is an elective procedure. This is not an emergency situation, unlike a refractory GI bleed or a difficult to manage GI bleed where you have to go in almost immediately. So I think endotipsitis is almost very, very difficult to treat, and it's almost like treating an endocarditis patient, and you can get into a spot of bother if you've not looked at this very carefully. The dental health is again something that we oftentimes overlook in our cirrhotic patients. So I think the points which Dr. Paul has made are very valuable. And contraindications, you can have someone who's got a peripheral hepatoma and very difficult to manage ascites, but anyone who's got a central hepatoma, hepatic cysts, masses, these would be people who should not be taken up for this procedure. Age more than 70, cardiopulmonary reserve being iffy, someone who's had non-precipitant hepatic encephalopathy in the past. So these would again be contraindications, and we've already spoken about the MELD and the Child-Pugh score. So anything beyond 25 is compassionate, and 18 to 25, there is a high risk of developing worsening of liver decompensation if you were to take them up for TIPS. But mind you, these are MELD and not MELD sodium scores. So 12C and 18 or higher. So Doppler you would do regularly to follow up these patients. Any thoughts on anticoagulation, sir? Are you a regular believer in anticoagulation?
No, sir. I think I'd go for the covered TIPS and see it out, sir.
Right. So I think
not an anticoagulant actually.
right.
I mean, these days, of course, we are using NOAC, but not in post-TIPS patient. They are usually kept without anticoagulation, and obviously they are using this covered PTFE stent.
Right. So I think both these points are well taken, but most interventional radiologists would be using heparin during the procedure, and they almost always want the patient to be on at least low molecular weight heparin for a short duration of time. Please remember that thrombosis in this particular circulation is dependent on flow rather than the hypercoagulability. So if you have been able to establish a good flow, then you know that this patient's stent is not going to get blocked. However, if you find that the Doppler studies are telling you that there is an increased velocity, so oftentimes the stent tends to malfunction where it is entering the hepatic vein. So that is the critical point where the stent stenosis occurs. So if you find that the velocities are increasing there, then you might have a situation where till such time you have re-intervened, you might want this patient to be on some anticoagulation. Modifications, just for the trainees, you might have somebody going in for a DIPS, which is directly from the IVC into the portal vein, which is something that we do commonly in patients with Budd-Chiari or venous outflow tract obstruction. At times, you might use the intravascular ultrasound or IVUS to dictate the tips. So these are the modifications. And medium to long term, once these patients get discharged, so 1 week, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and then 6 months, they tend to undergo a Doppler study. We must all be very mindful of the early complications. So if somebody is having high right atrial pressures immediately post procedure, you must diurese them. These patients must be given liberal doses of lactulose and plus minus rifaximin, though not evidence based, but this is what we all do, so that this patient, whatever you can preempt by way of managing encephalopathy, you would do that. And I think these patients over a period of time, which is generally a few weeks, would start to have an increase in the urinary sodium excretion, and that is how this ascites becomes easy to manage. However, it's not unusual to use diuretics for a short duration of time in them, and therefore one should not be wary of that. So immediately post-operatively, you have to look for the HE, the cardiopulmonary reserve, and liver failure. So these are the three photosystemic bypass related complications that you have to be wary of. So HE, a sudden increase in the preload which might affect the cardiac functioning, and liver failure because a lot of blood might be diverted away from the liver. So these three things one has to be mindful of. So this we have already talked about. Just to mention that tips also gets requested for people who've got difficult to treat varices. There is now also a school of thought which tells you that if these patients have got very high HVPGs at the time you've scoped them or you've done the hemodynamic studies, they might be sent for preemptive tips. So if the HVPG is more than 20, there is a very high failure rate of therapy. And if this patient's MELD score permits, then they should probably be taken up for a preemptive tips. We all spoke about the refractory ascites and hepatic hydrothorax. Please remember that HRS NACI is also a good enough indication. So again, this is something that we as clinicians fail to see. So if someone is having some response to diuretics, but the creatinine creeps from 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9 to 1.1, 1.2, we just accept it almost in a passive manner, not realizing that if this patient were then to undergo a transplant, there is a very high chance that this patient would develop CKD, or a chronic kidney disease soon after transplant. Budd-Chiari syndrome, portal vein thrombosis, is a relative contraindication, as Dr. Paul mentioned. This is again something very important. So as a precursor to surgery, so oftentimes we will see someone who's got otherwise preserved liver function, but has got either a bothersome hydrocele or an umbilical hernia, or somebody who's got symptomatic gallstone. So as a precursor to surgery to reduce the complications in the post-operative period, again, there is a valid indication to use this. And this is again now what is being increasingly the experience of centers which are tips avid. So we all have, so in the transplant setting, when you make nutritional interventions, it's almost impossible to see whether they have made an impact. But this is one area where one is absolutely sure that if somebody is able to be taken off from repeated paracentesis, it definitely leads to improvement in muscle mass as well as muscle quality. And there is absolutely no doubt that it improves the liver transplant free survival. So I think this particular case demonstrates that if you have someone who's been referred to you as a transplant for a transplant, has competing diagnosis, whether or not we should jump to treating something which is very obvious, or we should just spend some time with the patient and try to sort out the primary problem. Then now what are we going to do with this patient? Certainly once this patient is compensated, I'm going to try to treat him for the hepatitis C. And I think that is the time when probably this hepatitis C treatment would really, the management would really be fruitful. I think we are already short past the time. We'll be very happy to take any questions.
There are two questions on the chat box. One is somebody has asked whether you use alpha pump for refractory ascites.
Right. So I have no experience. So this is again automated low flow ascites pump. So this is a pump which is reprogrammable and rechargeable. So what it does is that it has got sensors both in the peritoneal cavity and the bladder, and there is a slow movement of the acidic fluid into the bladder. So the patient gets a kind of a feeling or sensation of normal micturition. and you can program it in such a manner that the patient would not have to wake up in the night. So we all know that one of the reasons why cirrhotic patients are also having abnormal cognition is because they remain awake most of the times in the night, because that is the time when the renal blood flow is good and they keep getting up to pee. So I think that is something that is so earlier models there was a lot of problems with infections, but I'm reading from published literature that now it is getting more acceptance. Have never used it. I think it's still prohibitively expensive. We do not know what the medium to long term results are and what it would do to the peritoneum per se. You know, the past experience from the Denver and the Levine, when you used to have cocoons in the abdomen, which would then make transplant extremely difficult. So my fear is that any intervention in someone who's got a congested peritoneum would be fraught with danger. So I am not a huge fan of this.
I think even the guidelines, like usual guidelines, they do not recommend
Ji,
using alpha pump. And there are complications like AKI and other things also. So it may not be easy.
yeah, so
The second
re-interventions and
question is, would
infections.
you like to use album? Sorry?
So the re-interventions as well as infections. So these are the two main
Main
drawbacks of using this.
alpha pump. Another question is whether we need to use albumin. Most of the time you use midodrine. So in a way, and another way around, that if we are using midodrine, would it be prudent to use albumin infusion at home as well
Right.
for refractory ascites?
So to answer this question, let's just break this down into two. So the first trial of so now I'm just switching gears of long-term albumin therapy. So most of us are aware and very confident of the short-term albumin therapy, which is for large volume paracentesis to prevent PPCD or with SBP or patients with HRS when you are using vasoconstrictors. So these are the short-term, well-validated indications of albumin. The long-term is what has been suggested by the ANSWER trial. In that trial, they have not used the other vasoconstrictors. One must remember that these are patients who've got not difficult to treat ascites. So it's just that they are on modest doses of diuretics, but these are not patients who've got a difficult to treat ascites. And therein one used 40 grams twice weekly for first 2 weeks and then 40 grams per week. And the trial duration was 18 months, and it was shown that the hazard ratio was very significant for development of first paracentesis as well as for refractory ascites. However, the trial which looked at both midodrine and albumin, which was the MAC trial, that was a negative trial. The patient cohort was different in the MAC trial. So these were patients who were waitlisted for transplant, and they were being given both midodrine as well as they were being given albumin. But the amount of albumin that was given to them was much lower. So that was 40 grams every fortnight, and also they were treated for a much shorter duration of time, and their MELD scores were much higher than in the ANSWER trial. And this trial was a negative trial. So it was shown that when you are using midodrine as well as albumin in this particular manner for waitlisted patient, it does not really have any benefit in improving the transplant free survival. My take on this, what we do in our practice is to use both midodrine as well as to advise domiciliary albumin, but this will be for the cohort of patients who've run out of options. So these are patients who cannot or who are not candidates for an intervention, say like TIPS, or who are not candidate for transplant. And I don't have data to support whether it really works, but this is what we do in our practice. So we would put them on midodrine as well as domiciliary albumin.
I think there is no other question on the chat box. Dr. Devashish Datta and Dr. P. Paul, any questions to Dr. Dharmesh Kapoor?
Have you ever used clonidine, Dr. Kapoor?
So
Yeah.
clonidine is a very interesting drug. So we know that in the pathophysiology of ascites, you have a huge role of the sympathetic nervous system stimulation. And that is why clonidine, which is a sympatholytic, and that is the premise of using this drug. So I have used it only very occasionally and have not got the desired effect because many of these patients were probably not the right candidates. I think the cohort in which we should use sympatholytics is the NAFLD cohort, in whom the pressure is not the limiting factor. So probably that is a cohort in which we dedicatedly look at the use of clonidine. And mind you, this dose is very, very small. It's less than the dose that we use for treatment of hypertension. Then probably it might be of some benefit. But
So,
pathophysiologically, this is a drug which can have a role to play.
So two quick questions, sir. One was from Dr. Dilip Todi, sir, because nowadays we find that many physicians and everybody, they are prescribing Vaptans for this management of ascites, especially when we see falling sodium level. So it's a tendency from the physician's part to give them Vaptans. So sir, what is your take on these Vaptans?
Right. So the only published literature is from the Postgraduate Institute, Chandigarh, Dr. Virendra Singh's study, where they have used midodrine as well as Vaptans. But the problem in that study is, if you read carefully, most of the patients have got an EGFR of excess of 100. So I think clearly this is not a very sick cohort. I am myself very wary of using Vaptans because, nowadays, at least in the region I practice, people are very aware, and oftentimes they go back and check on the net what the doctor has prescribed. So we know that Vaptans in patients who've got liver dysfunction, that has to be used very carefully for a very short duration of time. And now there is some emerging evidence that Vaptans probably are not very good for cirrhotic ascites anyway.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I think there was a study that showed higher mortality.
Mortality, exactly.
Yeah, so
Mortality,
there's a black
yes.
box warning to this. So it can precipitate transaminitis, liver failure. So my personal view on this is no.
Sir, another quick question is,
Hepatic hydrothorax.
Yeah, pleurodesis.
Recurrent hepatic hydrothorax. And this is actually pleurodesis or ICD insertion. ICD insertion is always no.
Yeah,
I mean,
so is pleurodesis. So I think the only way you might be able to handle this by a sclerosant is if you are doing a VATS. So we all know that there are these defects in the diaphragm which you might be able to seal off, but otherwise you never ever try using these tools. Which are good for pleural effusion of other etiologies, because you'll never be able to render the pleural space dry. So pleurodesis will work only when the pleural space is dry. So this is again something that one should almost never use.
And any role of midodrine with hydrothorax? I
So
don't
it's
think
pretty much the same. This is the acetic fluid which is trickling into the pleural space. So the pathophysiology remains pretty much the same.
There was a trial actually showing rifaximin plus midodrine is better.
Yes.
Rifaximin is looking at the other side of inflammatory hypothesis, this bacterial translocation. It has not been tried in other trials, but there was some pilot study. What is your comment on that?
So I think, sir, these patients will get a mixed bag. I will be brutally honest with you. So we are not doing it. So we are looking at what manages our patients with the least possible visits back to the clinic. So I think in a patient who's unwell, one would be using rifaximin, one would be using midodrine as tolerated and also as afforded. So that second part is as important as the first one. And obviously, like I said, this would be for that cohort of patients for whom there isn't a definite plan in place. So otherwise, as far as possible, you should try to, see if you can go down the pathophysiologic pathway and treat this patient definitively.
And the last question, Dharmesh, it is from me, that when would you really stop beta blockers?
All this particular patient, we started beta blockers right at the outset, sir. So anybody who's got any difficult to treat ascites, I would just stop it. So I think that is something which is very, very
that should
important.
Be a learning for everybody, that to stop beta blockers when there is refractory ascites, and maybe large ascites also. You are allowed to give a small dose of beta blocker. So it's always stop beta blockers, or you can.
I would mostly stop them, sir. I know there is some published literature which is again very heterogeneous group of patients. There is even a suggestion that in acute and chronic liver failure, on beta blockers they better.
Something like that saves life and all, from Rajiv's group and all that.
They were on beta blockers because they were still okay. So that is my take on it. So it's not as if they did better because they were on beta blockers, but it's the other way around. So maybe their circulatory dysfunction was not as much as those in whom you had to stop it. So I, for one, would definitely stop the non-selective beta blockers because of its effect on the renal circulation.
especially when there is refractory ascites, large ascites, or just early ascites.
Or any difficult to manage ascites. So if I'm having to
Yes,
stop the diuretic dose, tweak the diuretic dose, get the patient in for tapping or for albumin, which is not scheduled, I would just stop the beta blockers.
Any final comment from Dharmesh? And then I think we should close. It's already obvious in 9:30.
Yeah,
Any
so
final
there
comments?
is a huge bit to, you know, the message. If there is one message that I would like to give today, that is our dependence on urine electrolytes is very dismal. So we as practicing hepatologists, we mostly go by the serum markers, but I think the urine electrolytes, they have a huge amount of information to give. Of course, it was not relevant to this case, but you have importance of this in patients who are encephalopathic. If somebody is having even advanced liver disease, including acute and chronic liver failure, what's its relation to serum ammonia, what it does to the excretion of ammonium. So I think urine electrolytes is something which is very grossly underrated in our day-to-day practice, and I think that is something that one would like to see changed in times to come.
And lastly, what about when would you really ask these patients to be assessed for transplant? I mean, that's a
So
general comment and also it's a guideline for the practicing doctors not to rely too much on medicines, tips. When exactly in the natural history one would like to send them at least for assessment? If
right,
because it's becoming generally available in almost all the large cities
yeah,
now.
yeah. So I think, sir, this is probably the best question you have posed. So this particular thing has stuck on in everybody's psyche, the MELD of 15. So the MELD of 15 to refer a patient for transplant is for the Western world. It is not for us. And most of the times people who've got, so if you were to ask me this question, what is the commonest indication to transplant people in our country? The answer is diuretic refractory or diuretic intractable ascites. That is the commonest indication. And most of the times these patients are low melders, and these patients they transit to a chronic kidney disease, and that is the biggest challenge. So you do not want somebody to be subjected to transplant with a creatinine of 1.2, 1.3. If you are having to do that, or if you are forced to do that, you are doing this patient a huge degree of harm. So there is enough published literature to suggest that as early as 3 months post transplant, these patients would become CKD3. So it's not just the value of creatinine you are looking at. So initially there is a honeymoon period, the creatinine normalizes, but then again it slowly begins to inch up. So I think this is the kind of mindset we have to get out of. So either you try a definitive plan for this patient, and I'm a strong believer in tips. So if your patient selection is good, these patients will definitely do well. But oftentimes in a patient like this, I would always do the transplant evaluation and tell to the patient that this is an interim procedure but might have a long term beneficial effect for you, so that tomorrow even the referring physician doesn't have a chance to tell you that I referred for transplant and you gave him something else and this patient is now down in dumps. So I think this is what we do on our unit. So you would do, see, transplant evaluation does not cost much. What is actually transplant evaluation? Transplant evaluation is only an assessment of the cardiopulmonary status. Around everything else you can work. So you must make sure that this patient doesn't have a portal cavernoma, and you must make sure that this patient has got a reasonable cardiopulmonary reserve. So this transplant evaluation, if you are not planning an imminent transplant, can be done in less than 6 hours and at a fraction of cost of what the actual transplant evaluation costs you. So what are the other things? We are doing some very fanciful things like CMV, blah blah blah. So those things can always be done when you are planning a transplant. In any case, their validity is for a short duration. So I think if these three things are done, a proper imaging, correct assessment of cardiopulmonary status, then I would just go ahead and try to see if there is an interim procedure that would short them out. And if it doesn't work for us, supposing we all know that TIPS leads to encephalopathy, so one would be lying if one were to say that the patients who are being given covered stents don't develop encephalopathy. The incidence is lower, but they still do develop it. So I think then we have to go to the next step.
Thank you, Dharmesh. We had a very exciting evening, and I would like to thank Dr. Devashish Datta and Dr. B.B. Pal for very encouraging and stimulating discussion. And last but not the least, Dr. Sujit Chaudhary for arranging a very exciting evening on refractory ascites and the rest of it. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you, sir. Thank you. Good night.
No, actually, just
Oh,
conclusion. I am on behalf of GMAS. I want to thank Dr. Dharmesh Kapoor for his brilliant discussion on the management of refractory ascites. And on behalf of GMAS, I want to thank Dr. Konar, Dr. Devasis Datta, and Dr. Bhaskar Vikas Pal. Now I request Mr. Jason Lawrence of Cipla Medical Services to say a few words and final vote of thanks. Please, we are sorry. Please wait. Mr. Jason, please. Uh,
On behalf of
I
everybody,
think he's not been able to connect. Then okay, I must thank and I may to all of you, and
Thank you.
we can.
thank you. Actually,
It's all pleasure.
yeah, it's a great learning experience for me also. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity.
Yeah.
Good night.
Great.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, everybody. Yeah.